Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to bring you today's episode. I'm here with Perdita Finn, who is the co founder with her husband, Clark Strand, of this non denominational international fellowship called The Way of the Rose, which was inspired by their book by the same title, The Way of the Rose: The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine Hidden in the Rosary. And in addition to extensive study with Zen masters, priests, and healers, Perdita has also apprenticed with the psychic Susan Saxman, with whom she wrote The Reluctant Psychic. Finn now teaches popular workshops on getting to know the dead, and in those, participants are really empowered to activate the magic in their own lives with the help of their ancestors. She's also the author of Take Back the Magic: Conversations with the Unseen World, and lives with her family in the moss-filled shadows of the Catskill Mountains. Perdita, I'm really honored and excited to have you on the podcast today. And is there anything else that you'd love to add to sort of framing yourself for the listeners before we dive in?
Well, Grace, I'm really excited to be here. And, my book was published this week. It's been a labor of love over the past 10 years of collaborations with those on the other side and also with a lot of living supporters. But so it feels like the end of a very celebratory week for me. And, it's kind of dessert to be here. So
Oh, that's
thrilled.
so exciting. Congratulations. I know that's it's a big effort to get a book out into the world.
It
So,
is.
um, I think I don't want to center all of our conversations on the Way of the Rose, because I know your work has really evolved towards working with the dead and psychic realms and all of those things. So I'd love to spend a lot of time there. However, my first encounter with your work was through the Way of the Rose. It was at the beginning of the pandemic. I was on social media at the time. I'm not anymore. And someone I trusted really shared the book on their feed. And so I was ordering a pile of books for that initial, quote, 2 week period when we were staying home. And I had no idea what to expect from the book. I was skeptical. Like, I grew up in church, though not the Catholic Church. And it wasn't really a place I was going back to in any way, not even philosophically. But the book really unfolded in a really direct and beautiful way that touched me a lot. And I'm wondering if you would share with us, for those who are new to your work, sort of how the Rosary found you all, and sort of the perspective or practice that it's really kind of grown into your way of being in the world.
So first of all, I'm not Catholic.
Yeah.
I wasn't raised Catholic. I'm not Catholic now. I'm not even Christian. I don't affiliate with any religion. People ask me what I am, and I say I'm an animal trying to remember how to be a good animal. and so that's really important for me to say. That said, and my husband and I have written a trio of books, and we say we write about the dark, the dirt, and the dead. And the dark, he wrote a book called Waking Up to the Dark, about his encounters with the Dark Mother. Call her Kali, call her the Black Madonna, by any name you want to call her is what we say, but she's the dark womb of the cosmos. And then we wrote The Way of the Rose together, which was about our recovery of the Rosary. And that's been a very long journey for me. And I tell some of that story in Way of the Rose, and more of it in how I discovered the Rosary or the Hail Mary after I had an abortion,
Mm.
and not as a way of validating that experience, actually. Um, and it, I didn't know how to make sense of the experiences I was having with these beads. And one of the things my husband and I have been very curious about for a long time is, what is our spiritual response to climate change? These religious expressions have all grown up within patriarchy, within civilization, and they keep us trapped inside of those insidious paradigms. And how do we find a way out of them so that we can get to some healthier, wholer place of relationship to the natural world? And that had been a real journey for both of us, to back, forward, dreaming. And in the midst of it, I was praying the rosary, and I couldn't tell you why. And I couldn't tell anyone why. How can I explain how an ex-Buddhist, wild woman is praying these traditional, like my a little old Irish grandmother. But it turns out those little old Irish grandmothers and Italian grandmothers were part of a tradition that goes back not just tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, there are beads that have been found in Morocco that are 120,000 years old.
Mm.
So they go back to our very origins as a species. And making beads is pretty arduous work. To fashion a bead from bone or shell, it's time consuming work. So why are you doing it? Is it just adornment? But I would ask listeners, take a bead, any bead, if you've got an earring or a necklace on or a button, you can roll it between your fingers and just roll it between your fingers as I'm speaking and begin to notice somatically how you feel in your body. And you may begin to notice your blood pressure come down. Just that gesture of rolling between your thumb and index and middle finger a bead. Why is that? It's because as primates, as animals, our first gesture is not to let go, but to hold on.
Mm.
And to hold on specifically to our mother's nipples. And to get the milk, we roll our mother's nipple between our fingers so that the milk expresses and lets down. And the sweetness of the world, the nourishment we need, comes from that gesture. So when people in times of crisis, throughout deep time, whether it was the Mount Toba eruption 70,000 years ago, which reduced the amount of people on this planet to 5,000 in the Horn of Africa, or some other cataclysmic event, of which there have been plenty. What did people do? Did they let go or did they hold on? They made beads and they held on. And the Rosary, as we know it today, emerged out of the Black Plague in Europe. And it was a way for people who lived in villages that they'd been living in for 8 to 10,000 years to express their devotion to their cosmic mother. Call her Mary, call her Freya, call her the Kali, call her Anu, call her whatever you want to call her. She's Mama. And to hold on to her. And so my husband and I did a lot of kind of archaeological excavation on the history of the Rosary, showing that in fact it was a kind of parallel spiritual tradition that grew up alongside Catholicism, but somewhat antithetical to it.
Mm.
And in fact, the church was always trying to kind of control and crush. And so we created this feral fellowship of rosary prayers all over the world. That's the
Mm-hmm.
story of ours with the rosary. Also, fascinatingly to me, many psychics I've met, and I have many friends who are psychics, and I've met many because I wrote a book with a psychic, pray the rosary. And they pray the rosary to open the portal between the worlds.
Mm.
It is a method of thinning the veil. John Edwards has written a book on the rosary. He's a famous psychic. In German, the word Rosengarten means, it has 5 meanings. One is a rosary. Another is a collection of stories.
Mm.
The third is a rose garden. The fourth is a woman's genitalia. And the fifth is a graveyard. And so that linking of beauty, sex, death, all coming together in this fertile dirt of the rosary is why it's such a, many people who pray the rosary have visions. Many people experience encounters with those from the other side. It's very common. And that actually became my experience the more I prayed, I was actually talking to the dead before I began praying the rosary, but once I began praying the rosary, things got really wild.
Mm. I'm sure it's like solidifying the bridge.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Why? I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about. I think I don't want to take one's personal experience and necessarily extract it into
Mm-hmm.
the general, if there is a general experience, but if there's a sense of sort of nowness in the air, it feels like around sort of retrieving some of these, what have historically been like women's mysteries,
Yeah.
religions and practices. And it has a very now feeling
Yeah.
to it. At least for me, it does.
Me too.
Um, And I'm wondering if you could potentially share any of your perspective or experience with that. For me, you mentioned climate change earlier, which I think for me is very much connected to that.
Yeah. Well, the word you used is mystery.
Mhm.
And we have been in the age of enlightenment since the 18th century, right? It's the great forgetting, the great silencing. We have become addicted to light, clarity, answers, information, right? Up and away into our heads, into abstractions. Maybe we can even get off this planet and go populate Mars. No
Mhm.
one's quite sure how our microbiome is going to survive that transplant, but you know what I mean? There's these techno narcissists don't even know how their own bodies function.
Mhm.
Um, but the age of darkness, the dark ages, are actually the ages of growth and spiritual connection and spiritual intimacy. We put people in cells with the lights always on to torture them. People go mad if you don't turn off the lights. And yet now we live in a hyperlit world 24/7, a world where we think we can know the answers to everything, where scientists figure out what things are by breaking them apart and studying the pieces that have been shattered. But the ancients knew that life was a mystery. They knew that behind us were vast, dark mysteries, that we have lifetimes behind us, some of which we retain fragmentary memories of, but most of which is dark. And before us is darkness. And beneath us is the soil and the dirt of darkness. And our little blue marble of a planet circles through what is mostly dark matter in the universe. But just because it's dark and mysterious doesn't mean that it's empty. In fact, it's fertile and alive. And our planet, just like our souls, are seeds in that darkness that are coming into bloom. We put seeds into the darkness to grow. Babies grow in the darkness of the womb. And womb darkness is very, very comforting and very healing. But it's also comforting to know that we are not alone in the darkness. And that's what my book is really about.
Mhm.
What does it mean to step into a darkness that's filled with mothers who've loved us from lives we cannot even remember, who even now are reaching out to hold us? I often say the opposite of God isn't goddess, it's everything.
Mhm.
Everything is alive. And what beings on the other side remember is that we've all been each other's mothers. That's the wisdom. Wisdom is different than information. We live in the information age with very little wisdom.
That is true.
But wisdom knew the ancients was a woman with a dark face. It was the dark womb of the cosmos. Wisdom is dark. Wisdom comes from the inside out, from the feet up, from our roots deep in the ground. And yeah, I think as women right now want to reclaim that was actively suppressed. The war against the earth has been a war against women's wisdom.
Yeah, I was listening to some Indigenous women recently talking about some of the visions that they had in their own practices. And these are people with no European heritage. They are indigenous to what we call the Americas. But in their vision, they had such a sense of the wound that had happened through things like the witch trials. And though while that's happened in specific locations to particular people, that there's sort of like a sort of a cosmic wound that really occurred that kind of is also coinciding with the Enlightenment in a lot of ways, and that we're in an era now where we're like that sense of retrieval and healing and re-empowering um, is something that she's felt really called to sort of like facilitate, even though that's not necessarily directly like her heritage in that particular way, which I found deeply moving and something that I feel kind of coming up to me as you in response to what you're to what you're saying, that sense, that desire of reclamation.
I think we don't know our history very well, and that's on purpose.
Yeah.
And there's when people think of sort of witches or the witch craze, they're often imagining superstitious medieval
Hmm.
people going around pointing fingers at each other, killing each other. In fact, they weren't. The witch craze began on the eve of the Enlightenment,
Hmm.
and it was most active in the most educated, most scientific areas of the world. So the emergence of the scientific revolution brings with it this violence against women. In
Yeah.
Germany, in England, and Scotland, and at Harvard. Let's be honest. The Salem witch trials weren't about a bunch of hysterical adolescent girls trying to kill each other. They were about a bunch of theological men from Harvard coming and murdering women in the
Yeah.
New World. And I think it's really important to look at this violence because what happened in that 200-year period in the late 1500s, 1600s, early 1700s in Europe doesn't end. The war just gets translated to the New World, right? And it becomes against Black and brown women's bodies.
Hmm.
It doesn't end, it doesn't stop. The experiments, the violence, the sexual torture, it's all ongoing. It's never stopped. But the recipients of that violence have changed. And that's why I think it's really important for my next book is actually explicitly all about this. It's
Mm.
called Beyond the Witch Wound to a World Renewed.
Mm.
Because how do we both acknowledge these entangled nightmares of civilization, right, and move through them to something else without getting stuck in them?
Hmm.
And for me, the way that we do that is very intimate and very personal because we have mothers, ancestral mothers, all of us, who remember something else. We have mothers from before civilization right now waiting to guide us out of this patriarchal horror story.
I guess that's making me tear up. Um, which kind of leads us into your work with the unseen and working with the dead in particular. And do you mind sharing with us some of the ways that connecting with ancestors in that way has really helped in your own healing, but also I feel like it's also supporting a retelling or a reimagining of the world that we could live in?
Well, you know, there's so much to unpack here. So let me see from this conversation, it was juicy conversation we're having. To reclaim these old ways of these old women is not just about shifting our focus from God as a man to God as a woman. It's a it's a completely new belief sphere or an old belief sphere that we have to reclaim. And it's a radical animism that remembers that we have many mothers and we have many lifetimes. And I often say lineages are a lie because there are no straight lines in nature. Go back 7 generations and you have 200 grandmothers. Which one are you going to choose from as most important? Or are you going to let yourself be circled by them? So I sometimes say we don't have matriarchies or matrilineal lines. We have the matrosphere that we live inside of. Someone says that sounds like a mattress. And I said, good, because it's sleep and sex. And that's what we can reclaim, right? We
Exactly.
can claim all that juicy wonderfulness that we most so desperately need to reclaim for ourselves. So long live the matrosphere. But for me, that work feels very big, but also it's incredibly intimate. I call on the dead by name. This was a practice, and this is what I write about in my book, Take Back the Magic. It is a practice that grew out of a fight with my own mother. And, she was an atheist. She wasn't just an atheist. My mother, the best part of my mother was disinterest in anything spiritual or religious. But she was a very vibrant animal. And she loved to garden and grow things. And she made pate out of organ meats, and we had boa constrictors in our house and too many cats. And she had a kind of feral aliveness that was really delicious, but she wasn't always a very soft or affectionate mother. When my own daughter was born, um, and she also drank too much, and which was really problematical. Right after the birth of my own daughter, which I write about in the book, she and I had a terrible fight. I mean, a
Mm.
fight where I really felt like I might kill her. Um, it felt like an imminent possibility. And I called my husband, and we had a talk, and I calmed down. And I grew up in this house surrounded with windows. My mother loved growing plants. It had lots of glass windows. And I realized all my life I'd felt faces staring in.
Mm.
I said, who are these women, these unhappy, miserable women who've all fought with their mothers? And one of our legacies of the witch craze is that mothers were encouraged to turn in their daughters to the inquisitors to save their lives.
Mm.
Daughters were encouraged to turn in their mothers to save their lives. And we've forgotten what this has done to the relationship of mothers and daughters.
Mm.
My own daughter and I have worked very hard to heal. We say that our intimacy with each other is our radical defiance against patriarchy.
Mm.
And it's really hard work, in this culture. Be independent, separate, cut the umbilical cord, don't be a helicopter mother. All these ways we want to, we put babies alone in a room screaming, and somehow that's going to make them feel better about the universe.
Right. It'll help them go to sleep.
Don't even get me started.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so my mother did that. My mother, the fight began because my mother told me to let the baby cry, and I said, forget about it. But I was feeling all these ancestral women, and I went up into my mother's bedroom where she was crying,
Mm.
and she had a wall of all of her ancestors. And suddenly I realized those were the faces. That she, this non-religious woman, non-spiritual woman, was summoning the dead.
Mm.
And it was an opening for me, and I began summoning the dead. And I call them the dead because, yes, I call them my grandmothers, my aunts, my cousins, my greats, whatever. But they're my teachers, my pets, the tree, the hemlock tree where I sat under as a child that got cut down. That too is my mother. I call on all the dead. I call on dead that I don't even remember the names of. I go out in my backyard, and I can find, even though I live in the mountains, the Catskill Mountains, there are rocks with seashells in them from oceans 350 million years ago. And I call on those dead sea creatures to guide me.
Mm.
So when I summon the dead, I'm doing it very intimately, but I'm also expanding it beyond mere biology and biological connection.
That feels really freeing when I hear you say that, because I think for some people, in ways that I've heard, and that can be kind of a real sticking point for them, and being like, well, I don't have a great relationship with my ancestors, or I don't know who they are, or I don't know if they're supportive, or etc.
Well, here's the thing about it also, too. Religious authorities wanted to separate women from their power, right? To gain control over them. And the way that they did that was by silencing their conversation with the dead. This is explicit. Max Dasho, in her book Witches and Pagans, documents how often the priests are writing to the bishop saying, we can't get these damn women to stop talking in the graveyards to their dead. How do we get them to listen to us?
Mm.
Right? In her book Witch Craze, which is the best book about the European witch craze, Anne Barstow documents that the single thing that got women most accused of witchcraft wasn't midwifery, it wasn't herbalism, it was talking to the dead.
Mm.
And why? And it's if women are getting their power from below, how do we cut off their power at the base? We silence the conversation with the dead. And it's been a propaganda campaign to make people frightened of the unseen world. Look at the ubiquity of horror movies in our culture. Right? these are all designed to shut down the animist conversation with the other unseen world. I say, put me in a haunted house. I'll talk to the dead. Don't put me in a boardroom on Wall Street with reasonable men.
Yeah, I feel like, when you were saying, shutting down the connection from below, I was just thinking of I was also thinking of just like our literal connection to the electromagnetic field of the earth that is so blocked because we
Yes,
don't go outside without shoes, or
exactly.
because there maybe is no dirt where someone lives and they can only be on pavement, et cetera. And just how that's such, that's something that I feel very viscerally in my own life and something that I notice a lot.
Grace, you're in Atlanta, right?
I am.
I have a great deep connection to Atlanta, you know.
I don't know. Tell me.
Oh, speaking of that land, well, my husband grew up there.
Oh, really?
Yes. And, I tell this story in my book. This is sort of, but the land calls us, land is very powerful, and the land calls us and the dead call to us.
Hmm.
We all are where we are, everyone listening to this, because the dead of that land have called to you for reasons we may not even understand, right?
That's true.
And so my husband grew up there. He did leave when he was 18 to get out of the South as fast as he could, but
I
it was the
understand that.
1970s.
I
But
understand that impulse. I
what?
said I understand that impulse.
Atlanta was a different place in those days.
Hmm.
Um, but when I was 10 years old, my mother took me to see Gone with the Wind, of all god awful movies.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was in the old days when you could only see a movie on the big screen because they'd reissued it. And I was 10 years old and I came out of the movie and I was obsessed with
Mm.
Atlanta. And I went to our little local library and said, "Can I have some books on Atlanta?" And they're like, "No, no." And, we can give you a book on the Civil War or whatever. And I wanted to go to Atlanta. And I kept saying to mother, "Can we go to Atlanta?" My mother was like, "No, we're not going to Atlanta." And it was this wild obsession. And when I was 10 years old, my husband was 15. He's 5 years older than I am. We discovered the day we met that when he was 15, he moved to Atlanta. And
Mm.
it was as if my soul was looking for him. And when we finally visited many, many years later, we went back on a trip with his family. I realized I had been dreaming into this land to try and, my soul at night had been trying to find him for so long.
That's so beautiful. It's like trying to pinpoint time, which is space, like where you all would
Right.
converge. That's really beautiful. I love that. Um, it makes me earlier, you said the mattress sphere, and something that's really emerged, not to go like too deep, but maybe we will, of like time is just a sphere. And it's something that we can connect through, and that we're living like our past lives are our simultaneous lives, right? And that these are things that we can strengthen links and cords to, or not our pathways to, through the roots of above and below, and through our fields and prayers, etc. And so that's what I was thinking when you were saying that. And even just like the convergence of you two in Atlanta at that moment was just felt like it was really kind of rerouting or gridding something
And there
into
you are
there.
in Atlanta, and I come up, and that's sort of, you know what I mean? And it's not just a place name or a place. It's a whole ancestral realm that's there, calling to us, connecting us. People are very interested in the mycelial networks of fungi right now,
Hmm.
because I think it's that sense that we are woven together in these
Hmm.
great circles of belonging. I sometimes say, don't think of a soul as an object, as a pearl. Think of a soul as a long, long red thread, creating the very fabric of existence woven together with other threads, right? And that fabric exists in the 10 dimensions. And that's the mystery of it all, right? We don't know how our souls are entangled with other souls, but we can feel it.
Hmm.
So you meet someone and you go, "I've met you before,"
For sure.
right?
Absolutely.
And you go to a place and you go, "I've been here before." Or we have a dream and it's like, it's my mother's house and it's my dorm in college, both together,
Right. For sure.
Because time and space are like origami. They're not like a line.
Yeah, and I feel like time is it's a reality's move. It's a live, writhing thing. And I feel like something that stands out to me a lot about your work and your work as a pair and even like the reluctant psychic, etc. It takes a lot of courage to just share transmission. It takes a lot of courage and vulnerability to show up that way in the world. I feel like, in particular, as a woman, I think still there's a lot like, if we're like, oh, this man transmitted this thing, we're like, now he's an occult leader that we like praise and like buy all their stuff. But then if it's a woman, we're still like, oh, that's silly. That's just like a silly thing that you think or whatever. That's not really how the world works, or that's not what's coming, or that's not what we need to do. And so I first want to just say it takes so much heartfulness to show up in the world that way and I don't take that lightly. Um, and also, I love the titles like Reluctant Psychic. So I'm wondering if you would tell me a little bit about just how the reluctance also meets the gift, meets the courage, in that way of just showing up.
Well, thank you, first of all, for acknowledging the vulnerability of this moment for me, which means a lot to me. Sometimes friends would say to me, how are you feeling about your book coming out? Are you excited? And I would
I'm
say,
terrified.
I'm terrified. I'm in a state of abject terror. I
Yeah.
actually erupted at one point before the book came out this summer in this rash from head to toe. And I said,
Mm.
oh, I'm on fire.
Mm.
Like that's what it's doing to my body right now. And I worked with it, got the message. But yeah, it's very vulnerable and very scary to, God knows if my family is going to read it.
Right. Even more terrifying.
Even more terrifying. But what is the reluctance? The pull of the conventional, the pull of the homogenizing, right?
Hmm.
And it's we live in this culture, this relentless, oppressive. There's one way to do things. There's one way, and I want to say, nature shows us that it glories in diversity. I mean, nature is diverse and it's always striving. It doesn't want one kind of apple, it wants 100 kinds of apples.
Hmm.
It's more interesting, it's more fun.
Hmm.
And so, can we sort of celebrate that uniqueness? But yeah, as a woman, it's very, very vulnerable. The book I wrote, The Reluctant Psychic, with Susan Saxman, she's an extraordinary woman. She changed my life. But her own life has been a real challenge. She has struggled to separate the living from the dead. She can't always tell the difference about who's who. And she's an oracle. She would have been put, in a temple in the old days and cared for and loved and treasured. And people would have come to her to ask what do we do next?
Yeah.
And instead she's selling secondhand clothes and doing tarot readings for $20
Hmm.
when I meet her.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. It brings me back to this, the word mystery, and something that's really been landing a lot for me lately is how, the things that might be the most powerful things to know, going back to wisdom, are actually hidden things or things that are hiding behind funny stories or silly habits or secrets or jokes or riddles. And so that people who can't handle the power of the thing are like, oh, look at that foolish thing over there. And then they move on. And so there's like a protection thing in with it too. It's a dance, really, but I feel like that's something that I've really been sitting in the revelation of lately.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I agree with you 100%. In fact, I've been having a deep dive into the work of Mark Twain right now,
Mm.
who, I don't know if you know this about him, he felt the most important book he ever wrote was his book about Joan of Arc, which is
Oh,
such a weird thing. Like, okay, none of the documentaries or movies about Mark Twain will ever mention the book that he considered his masterpiece.
no, I'd never heard of
No,
it.
no. Okay, not that it's a great book, but but he devoted his life to it. He hated religion, he hated France, and he was devoted to Joan of Arc. And I have been doing a deep dive on his reading. In his autobiography, he says, I've been born more times than Krishna. And he was a
Mm.
precog. He had precognitive dreams and experiences. He could see his own death. He saw his brother's death, his daughter's death. He was clearly having tremendous psychic experiences and psychic intuitions. And yet he's a humorist, writing funny stories. Well, I've gone back, I'm going and doing a deep dive and realizing, oh, he's hidden Easter eggs in these books.
Mm.
Do, and it's just like this. My husband and I wrote about the Rosary. The Rosary was where some people go, oh, I don't want to do that Catholic prayer. I go, oh my gosh, it's the most radical pagan thing you've ever done in your whole life. And it'll even go like, oh, I don't want to say the Hail Mary. It's a Christian prayer. And I go, no, the Hail Mary was where our grandmothers hid their devotion to the triple goddess.
Mm.
They wrote that prayer. They didn't
Mm.
even write it. They said it. And it was a way of hiding their devotion to the triple goddess in plain sight.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times I'm fascinated, for instance, with folk practices of the saints, because a lot of old lore is hidden there, a
Mm.
lot of old magic.
What's one or some of your favorite nuggets that you've discovered in
So
that
St.
joyride?
Christopher, there's so many. I've got a whole book about the saints. That's
Yeah.
another book I'm working on, but slowly. But say St. Christopher.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people have St. Christopher medals in their cars, and they're there to protect you, you know, if you're driving in your car, right? You know, just superstitious little saint. And he got discredited by the Catholic Church as not being a real saint, as being just a folklore saint, which is always the most interesting tell.
For sure.
So St. Christopher, the story of him is that he's a giant with a dog's head. Already you can see he's half animal and half human, like the old gods of old, who are often what are called teriomorphs, half human, half animal, remembering that we're sort of always moving between the animal and the human, the plant and the animal. We're not one thing, we're everything. Who carries the Christ child, which for me is always kind of the life force of the planet, not Jesus as a singularity, but life as a great green wick of power that exists on this planet. He carries that Christ child across a river.
Mm.
And that's why, because he carries him, you put him in vehicles. I did some research. He's connected to Anubis,
Mm-hmm.
who has the head of a jackal, who carries people from the land of the living to the land of the dead and back again. So he is the vehicle of as we move, our souls move from one lifetime to another. So I pray to him every day. I pray to St. Christopher in two ways. One, I pray to him that my kids just don't have a car accident. So yes, I pray to him in the traditional way, right? But I also pray to him thinking about my soul in the vehicle of this body. So if you think of your body as a vehicle for your soul, carrying you through life, right? So this is what I pray to him every day. Protect all beings from this vehicle.
Mm.
Protect me within this vehicle. Help me to use this vehicle to do good. Let me never miss the beauty of the world through speed. Guide me to my destiny. So I say that every morning, and I think of my children in their cars and their old clunky, you know, secondhand Subarus, and I think of me in this body. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's as soon as you said dog, I was like Anubis, and then I love that connection so
exactly,
much.
right?
Yeah, that hiding in plain sight, I think, is a really common sort of folk survival tradition, and something that's really become a part of me, sort of reclaiming some things about myself that feel powerful, or things that I would normally um, like the way that we don't necessarily appreciate things that come naturally to us or things that we're good at. And one of those things for me is beauty, and a phrase that's really been helping me reclaim a lot of things. Beauty is enough. It's enough to make something beautiful and magic and delicious. That's enough. It doesn't have to mean anything else. It doesn't have to and that's enough. And that's been a really revelatory thing that's been sort of coming into my body, because a lot of my life has been spent like, well, that's not enough. It has to be about this other thing. It has to be about this. It has to be smart. You got to back it up. You got to find a sort, all these other things. And so beauty is enough. And um, I'm wondering, that's sort of a precursor to framing, this connection, I think, between creativity and what we would call spirituality. Like for you, I would imagine that a lot of your writing process, it's about research, but there's also a lot of like channeling involved with a lot of those things, and even around what to read, the sort of the way that creativity and spirituality, whether it's making bread or making songs or hosting a dinner or making flowers, is sort of connected to the bridge, so to speak. And that's not really a question, but I wonder if you would riff
Well,
on that.
first of all, someone in the Way of the Rose community said recently, I'm sorry, I can't remember who, but she said, I know I'm on the right path when it's beautiful.
It's true.
The way of beauty is the reassurance and the longing for beauty. And, I can go in a lot of different directions with this. So is it okay with you if I go wild and deep
Please,
with
yes,
it?
please be wild. It's fine.
One of the things I'm fascinated by is when devotion to the lady arises, by whatever name you want to call her, so does beauty.
Mm-hmm.
The troubadours start singing. You know, the tarot card decks emerge with all these beautiful images, right? Suddenly, creativity, the divine, the devotion to the lady makes things beautiful. And she, just the way nature is, you take a concrete wasteland and you let nature get going, and nature's going to try to figure out, how do we make this beautiful again? And so a dandelion or some chicory is going to poke up through the concrete, and then the kudzu is going to come in and say, all right, I can eat the heavy metals and get things going here, right? Like, I love watching that slow, we'll make it diverse, we'll make it beautiful again. And I think that creative impulse, that desire to come in and make things beautiful, it comes from the mother, comes from the earth, comes from her womb, comes through us. Since I began writing with the dead, like, I have too much writing happening. But I actually teach a course, a long course, which helps people begin, and they work in our artistic medium as we work with the dead.
Mm.
And it is astounding what begins to happen when these collaborations occur. Like, the music, this art, we do an event on the solstice, and I invite everybody to, you should come. It's like, it's just wild. And of course, that's what the great artists, the poets, the novelists have always known,
Mm-hmm.
that this was we call it the muse, call it the muses, call it whatever you want to call it, but it's a collaborative enterprise with the other side.
For sure. I love whenever I love watching documentaries about just like famous artists. And there's always a part, like people who've really just like done something that changed how we think about their medium or whatever. And they're always like, the songs are just up there. You just catch them. Like there's always a reference to something where he's like, oh, you got to catch it. You got to like pull it. Like there's this sense of like they just pulled it in. And
My
I
daughter
love
and
that.
I are both lovers of Bob Dylan, and I live in Woodstock, New York, where he did, worked with Big Pink and the band and everything. So he's, Bob Dylan is everywhere, but we've always been devoted to him. And one of the things we love are the interviews in the early days when they're asking him questions about his process. And he just goes, I don't know, man. I just show up. Like, he doesn't know. Do you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't know. It happened to him and through him, and he made himself available to it in a lot of ways. Yes, he was an omnivorous listener of music. In fact, people said like he stole everybody's records, and he was priming his vehicle for this experience, and then it happened to him. And and people would ask him what it was like, and he couldn't even talk about it. Speaking of the mystery,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just there. It just came. I just heard it. And then it's a really
It,
beautiful flow.
yeah. Which doesn't mean you don't have to put in your work to be a good antenna for that reception.
For sure. You definitely do, I feel like. Um, is there anything that you feel like you would love to share with our listeners that you feel like I haven't made room for? Or
Well, one of the things that I try to always tell people is, the sum total of my work is really simple, which is the dead are real. All the dead are real, and they really want to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is you don't have to take my word for it. Begin saying their names. Begin asking for their help. I think one of the things we are taught not to ask for help. We're taught as those babies in a room by ourselves to scream ourselves to sleep. Not that anyone's going to come and answer our call, but
Mm-hmm.
the dead will answer your call. And they really will. And maybe it's as simple as a parking space in the beginning, or maybe it's as simple as, the blood work being better than it was last month, and maybe it's really profound healing you need to happen with somebody living in your family. But the dead will show up. And, my book is about how I healed with my father after he died, because he showed up for me after he died
Mm-hmm.
and he made amends. I was really angry at him. And I wasn't trying to forgive him. I was just, he was dead and I could be mad. I was going to kill him anymore with my anger.
Mm-hmm.
And he showed me that he was there. And he showed me that he got it, that he'd seen the mistakes he made, and he started making amends to me. And so none of our relationships with those on the other side are over. They're ongoing. There are new stories to tell. We can tell new stories about our parents, new stories about our ancestors. We don't have to stay stuck in the wounds.
Yeah. I feel like there's a way that under I guess I want to ask before we come to a close, the sort of this this connection between us healing, doing what we need to do to thrive, be a channel for beauty and magic, heal, is connected to the healing of humanity and the planet and paradigms, etc. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you understand that relationship, or maybe you don't think there's a relationship there.
Oh, I do. I
Um,
think it's crucial. Let me see if I can. We're all going to die.
yeah.
Everything dies.
Let's start there.
Okay. What?
I said, let's start there.
Is that okay? It is the thing as modern people we most want to pretend is not true.
Mhm.
Right? Death is seen as a failure. Like, you read now about these tech guys who are going to figure out some way to live to 175, but they also don't want to sleep anymore either. Like, I don't know about you, but sometimes getting into bed after a long day is the most delicious thing in the whole world. And I love going to sleep.
Me
And
too.
as far as I can tell, there's no difference between at a certain moment dying and going to sleep. And we get to wake up to a new day or a new life and a new canvas with which to work. That feels like a mercy to me. But everything dies. Trees die, rivers die, species die. We die, planets die, and everything without exception is reborn.
Hmm.
The only sobriety from the patriarchal horror story is the lived experience of the long story of our souls. We have to know we've been here many lifetimes before patriarchy, and we will be here many lifetimes after. Will we be human beings as we imagine human beings right now? I don't know. But life on this planet is what matters. Life itself is what matters. That
Hmm.
green wick of life force, that erotic life force, is what matters. And when I feel it within me, I know it won't die,
Yeah.
that it endures. And we have to know we're going to be reborn to the world we've made. No one's getting out of this. If the world's a mess, it's going to be more of a mess when we're reborn. I do an exercise in one of my workshops where I ask people to write a letter to their future mothers in their
Mm.
next life. What would you say to this person? And what if you meet a child who might be your future mother today? What if your future mother is living on a garbage pile in Mexico City or India? Can you imagine that? So if we can begin to live inside not the short story of a single life, but the long story of our souls, we're going to behave radically differently today.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Thank you for
Does that
sharing
answer
that.
your
It
question?
absolutely does. Yeah, no,
Okay.
thank you for sharing that perspective. I appreciate it. I would love for you to tell the listeners where they can find you on the internet, where they can get to find more about your work, your workshops, anything else that where you like people to connect with you.
So there are lots of different ways. I try to make myself as available as possible. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Perdita Finn. I've written a book, Take Back the Magic, Conversations with the Unseen World, that's for sale, wherever you buy your books. And I have a website, takebackthemagic.com, and I offer a lot of workshops. Like I say that, the dead are real, they want to help you and collaborate with you. It's like saying you make bread, you just take flour and water, mix it together and throw it in the oven. Sometimes there's some lost art forms to getting the sourdough riser going. And so we have a lot of conversations around that.
Beautiful.
Takebackthemagic.com. My husband and I have a very feral fellowship, the Way of the Rose, which you can find on Facebook. And we also have a website, wayoftherose.org. We offer prayer circles. They're 100% free. And not only are they free, we're writing a book called Circles Not Lines, Spiritual Community Beyond Patriarchy. And it's those communities, there are no experts, masters, teachers, gurus. And to ensure that, there's no money involved. Everything's 100% free. There's no promotion, marketing, or advertising, even of our own books. So, it's the friend zone.
Mm-hmm.
We say we value circles of friendship, not lineages of power. We don't even have buildings, no building fund. There's no
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
And we encourage and the other thing we don't have is public causes. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have any agenda. Our only agenda is that everyone find the seeds that have been planted in their own hearts and begin to help them grow. And we encourage each other to all do that, to grow a garden in your heart.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And if you're listening, we'll have all the links to those internet locations below in the show notes. You can check those out. And Perdita, thank you so much for joining me today and just for sharing so generously. I really appreciate it.
Great. I have to thank you. This has been one of my most fun conversations ever. I just feel like you just tapped right into the things I care about most in the
Oh,
whole
good.
world.
That's
Thank
always my
you.
goal. Thank you.